This palm wine is amazing. I love it. I can't wait to drink more of it.
What happened to you? Answer me, why can't you speak? Oh my god, you really can't talk? What on earth happened to you? Where did you go? What happened to you? Please, tell me the truth. Did you eat or drink anything at all?
My husband spent the night with his side chick and lost his voice forever. He drank from her cup at midnight, and by morning he could not say a single word. Not good morning, not his wife's name, not even a scream when the pain came. And the strangest part, he wasn't sick. His throat was fine. His tongue moved, but nothing came out, because something had been taken from him. And by the time you finish this story, you will understand exactly what that something was, and why it will make you check your own husband's phone tonight. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can sleep, subscribe now, because this one has 3 endings hiding inside it, and only one of them is the truth. Kelechi Obi was not a bad man when this story began. That part matters, so hold on to it, because by the time we reach the middle, you will start to doubt it, and by the end, you will not know what to believe about him at all. He was a bricklayer in the small town of Umuahia adjacent Igbeti, a man with rough palms and a soft laugh, married for 9 years to a woman named Adaeze, who loved him the way the earth loves rain, quietly, completely, without asking for anything back. They had 2 children, a modest house with a tin roof that sang when it rained, a life that was not rich, but was by every account that mattered, whole. Then, the contracts stopped coming. It happened slowly, the way rot happens in wood. You don't see it until the day the chair collapses under you. First, it was 1 job cancelled, then 2. Then the whole street seemed to forget Kelechi Obi's name, as if some invisible hand had erased him from every ledger in town. Other bricklayers were hired, men with less skill than him, men who mixed cement wrong and still got called back. Kelechi sat at home more and more, watching his wife stretch soup across 3 days instead of 1, watching his children's school fees pile up like debt to a god he could not name. It was in that hunger, not the hunger of the stomach alone, but the hunger of a man watching his own worth disappear, that he first heard of the woman by the river. Her name was Ifeyinwa, though most people in Igbeti simply called her the woman near Iyagba stream, because names in a town like that are given carefully, and nobody wanted to be the one to say her name out loud too many times. She was beautiful in a way that men forgot their manners, skin like polished mahogany, eyes that seemed to know your secrets before you told them, and a laugh that made you feel, for just a moment, like the most important person alive. She was also, according to every rumor whispered over pounded yam and palm wine, extremely, inexplicably rich. Nobody knew where the money came from. She had no farm, no shop, no husband, and yet her compound had a gate of real iron, and her roof was aluminium, not rusted tin, and she wore wrappers that cost more than most men in Igbeti earned in a season. Kelechi first met her on a Tuesday, delivering blocks to a compound near her land, a job he'd taken out of desperation, at half his normal rate. She watched him work from her veranda, and when he was done, sweating and exhausted, she brought him water with her own hands in a cup carved from a wood he didn't recognize, dark as a night with no moon. "You work hard for a man nobody pays," she said, not as a question. He didn't answer. What was there to say? She was right, and there is nothing more disarming than a stranger who sees your shame clearly and doesn't flinch from it. She said, "Come back Thursday. I have more work. I pay well." He should have told his wife. That's the part the whole town agreed on later, when the story was already unraveling. He should have told Adaeze that a strange, wealthy woman had offered him steady work. But some part of him, the part that was tired of being seen as a failure at his own dinner table, wanted one thing that was only his, one secret that hadn't been picked over by hunger and shame. So he said nothing, and on Thursday he went. If you've ever wondered how ordinary men end up in stories like this one, not villains, not fools, just tired men who wanted to feel useful again, you're starting to understand it now. Keep watching because Adaeze is about to notice something, and once she does, this story stops being about a husband's secret and starts being about a death that was never his to pay in the first place. The work at Ifeyinwa's compound was easy, too easy if Kelechi had been paying attention. She asked him to repair a low wall that didn't seem to need repairing. She asked him to lay bricks around a well that already had a perfectly good rim. And every time he finished a task, she paid him more than the work was worth, counting the notes into his palms slowly, her fingers brushing his in a way that made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. Not lust exactly, though there was some of that too, but the particular warmth of being wanted, of mattering to someone. He told himself it was innocent. He told himself driving home each evening with money folded into his sock so Adaeze wouldn't ask where a bricklayer with no contracts had suddenly gotten cash, that he was simply doing a job. But a man does not hide innocent things. And Kelechi hid everything about Ifeyinwa, the work, the money, the way she'd started calling him my dear one in a voice as soft as a secret. Before the affair, before Ifeyinwa, before any of this, there had been a wedding under a blue tent behind Adaze's family compound 9 years earlier, with rented plastic chairs and a live band that played until the generator ran out of fuel. Kelechi was 25 then, still lean from years of carrying blocks up scaffolding, still full of a boy's confidence that hard work alone could build a good life, brick by brick, the same way he built houses for other men. Adaeze was the prettiest girl at St. Teresa Secondary School, the daughter of a herbalist mother and a quiet church-going father. And when Kelechi first asked her father for her hand, the old man had looked at his rough palms for a long time before nodding, saying only, "A man who can build a wall that doesn't fall down can probably build a marriage that doesn't fall down either." For 7 of their 9 years together, that had seemed true. Kelechi brought home enough. Adaeze managed what he brought with a shopkeeper's precision, stretching every naira until it groaned, and in the evenings they would sit outside their small house while their children chased fireflies in the dark, and Kelechi would tell Adaeze about the buildings he'd helped raise that week, describing each wall as if it were a small miracle, which in its own way it was. She used to tease him that he loved bricks the way other men loved football, and he used to say that a wall, once built well, stood for 100 years, and there weren't many things in this world a poor man could point to and say, "That will outlast me, and I made it with my own hands." It was the drying up of that pride, more than the drying up of the money itself, that hollowed him out in the 2 years before Ifeyinwa. A man who has always measured his worth in walls he's built does not know what to do with himself when nobody wants him to build anything at all. He would wake early out of habit, dress for work out of habit, and then simply sit on the veranda because there was nowhere to go, watching younger, less careful men driven past on the okadas to jobs that should have been his. Adaeze noticed this hollowing too, and she tried, in the beginning, to fill it, with encouragement, with introductions to distant cousins who might have contracts, with a patience that slowly, understandably, wore thin under the daily grind of stretching less and less food across more and more days. By the time the contracts truly stopped, something between them had already gone quiet in a way they neither of them had named yet, a silence that had nothing to do with rivers or spirits at all, only the ordinary, unremarkable erosion that poverty causes in even the most devoted marriages.
This is important because I don't want you thinking Kelechi was a monster looking for an excuse, or that Adaeze was a fool who noticed nothing. They were simply 2 tired people, worn down by circumstance, standing at the edge of a decision neither of them fully understood the shape of yet. And it is precisely this kind of tiredness, ordinary, unglamorous, the tiredness of unpaid bills and unspoken resentment, that something ancient and patient by a Yagba stream had learned over 3 generations to recognize from a great distance, the way a vulture recognizes stillness in a field long before it understands whether the stillness means sleep or death. The affair, when it finally became one, did not feel like a betrayal to him. That is the terrible human truth of it. It felt like breathing after being underwater. She would sit across from him after the work was done, pour him palm wine that tasted sweeter than any he had had before, and ask him about himself. Kelechi, the boy who used to want to be a carpenter before his father pushed him into bricklaying. Nobody had asked him that question in a decade. Kelechi's closest friend, a fellow bricklayer named Obina, who had known him since their apprenticeship days under the same master mason, was the first person in Igbeti to say something out loud, though even he did not say all of it. They were sharing a bottle of Guinness at the junction bar one evening when Obina, watching Kelechi count out crisp notes to pay for both their drinks, Kelechi Obi, who 3 months earlier had been borrowing Gary from neighbors, finally asked the question everyone else had only whispered. "This new client of yours," Obina said, turning his bottle slowly on the wooden table, not quite meeting Kelechi's eyes. "The one near Yagba stream. My uncle used to say things about that stretch of land, not good things." "Old man talk," Kelechi said, waving it off, though something in his stomach tightened at the words. "Maybe," Obina said, "but my uncle also said the man who used to own the plot before the woman came, Papa Ekena, you remember him, the one who used to sell palm wine near the market? He stopped talking to anybody after he went there one time to negotiate a land boundary. Just stopped, lived another 15 years and never said one more word to a living soul. His wife used to feed him with her own hands like a child right up until he died. Everybody said it was a stroke. Nobody who actually looked in his eyes believed that story." Kelechi laughed the story off that night, told Obina he was being an old woman about nothing, but he did not sleep well, and the next morning when his younger daughter, only 6 years old, climbed onto his lap the way she always did and asked him to tell her the story of the tortoise and the drum, he found himself holding her a little tighter than usual, without quite understanding why. It was around this time that his children began to notice his absences too, in the unguarded, honest way that children notice everything adults hope they haven't. His son, 9 years old and sharp as a new cutlass, asked him one evening why he always smelled like flowers when he came home from fixing walls, since walls, as far as the boy understood, did not smell like flowers. Kelechi laughed it off and said something about a garden near the work site, and his son accepted the answer the way children accept most adult answers, not because it made sense, but because questioning it further felt somehow dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate. Adaeze noticed the smell first. Perfume that wasn't hers, faint on his shirt collar, sweet like frangipani mixed with something else, something almost metallic underneath, like the smell of a coin held too long in a sweaty palm. She said nothing at first. A wife who has survived 9 years of marriage learns that silence is sometimes a woman's sharpest tool. You watch, you wait, you gather your evidence like a market woman gathering coins before she counts them. Then the money started appearing. Not large sums, not enough to raise real suspicion, but enough that Adaeze, who managed every kobo of their household with the precision of an accountant, noticed the extra notes tucked in places they shouldn't be, inside his work boots, folded in his Bible which he never opened, hidden beneath the mattress on his side of the bed. A man does not hide money he earned honestly. He hides money that comes with a story he's ashamed to tell. One evening, she asked him directly, "Kelechi, where is this money coming from?" "A new client," he said, too quickly, the way a man says something he's rehearsed, "near Iyagba stream."
Adaeze's spine went cold at the mention of that stream, though she didn't know why. That particular cold you feel before your mind has caught up with your body's warning. Her own mother, before she died, used to tell stories about a woman near that stream. Stories Adaeze had dismissed as an old woman's superstition, the kind of tale meant to frighten children away from wandering too far away from home. But her mother's voice, remembering it now, had sounded like she was not simply telling a story. It had sounded like a warning, passed down like an inheritance nobody wanted. If you think you know where this is going, I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because I promise you, you don't. Everyone in this story is about to be wrong about something. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, subscribe, because the version of this story you think you're watching is not the one you are going to get. 3 weeks into the affair, Kelechi began to notice small things about Ifeyinwa that his desperate and grateful heart had conveniently ignored. She never ate in front of him, not once. She would prepare food, beautiful food, jollof rice glistening with palm oil, peppered goat meat that made his mouth water, but she never took a single bite herself, always claiming she'd eaten earlier, always watching him eat with an expression he couldn't quite name. Hunger, maybe, or something closer to satisfaction, the way a farmer watches a crop she planted finally bear fruit. She also never let him see where she slept. Her compound was large, larger than a woman with no visible income should own, but there was always one door kept locked, one room she steered him away from with a light touch on his arm, and a change of subject so smooth he barely noticed he'd been redirected. Once, walking past that door, he thought he heard something. Not quite a voice, not quite water, but something in between, like a river trying to speak. He asked her about it once, just once. What's in that room? Her smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes did, something that made the hair on his arms rise before his mind understood why. My grandmother's things, she said. You wouldn't want to disturb them. He let it go. Men who are being fed, paid, and desired rarely ask the second question, even when the first answer doesn't sit right in their stomach. But the stomach, unlike the mind, does not forget so easily. 2 nights later, unable to sleep beside a wife whose silence had grown heavier and more deliberate each evening, Kelechi found himself lying awake replaying the sound from behind that locked door. Not quite a voice, not quite water, but something in between, like a river trying to speak. He told himself he was imagining things, like the way a guilty man imagines footsteps behind him on a dark road. But guilt, he was learning, has a strange way of sharpening the senses instead of dulling them. And by the time he next visited Ifeyinwa's compound, he found himself walking past that door more slowly than necessary, listening.
This time, he heard it clearly. A murmur. Not one voice, but several, layered over each other like a chorus humming beneath the surface of a river. Some of them low and rasping, some of them younger, almost childlike, all of them wordless, as though every syllable that had ever made them a voice had been filed away, leaving only the hollow shape of speech behind. He stood frozen outside that door for nearly a full minute, his pulse loud in his own ears, until Ifeyinwa's hand settled on his shoulder from behind. She had approached him without a single footstep announcing her, which should have frightened him far more than it did. Curiosity, she said softly, is not a debt I collect, but it is not free either. Come and sit. I made your favorite tonight. He should have run then. Every instinct beneath his desperation and his flattered heart was screaming at him to run, and for one suspended moment, standing outside that door with the murmuring chorus of the voiceless behind it, he very nearly did. But she took his hand, and her palm was warm, and warmth to a man who had spent 2 years feeling invisible in his own home was a stronger pull than fear had any right to be. He let her lead him back to the veranda, and within the hour, the memory of that sound had softened at the edges, the way most inconvenient memories do when a comfortable lie is sitting right beside you, smiling. Meanwhile,
Adaeze began her own quiet investigation, the kind only a woman raising 2 children on a shrinking budget knows how to conduct, without confrontation, without accusation, simply by paying closer attention to a world that had started keeping secrets from her. She spoke to her aunt, her mother's younger sister, a woman named Nkechi, who still lived in the family compound and remembered every story her late sister had ever told. The woman by Iyagba stream, Nkechi said, when Adaeze finally asked directly, her voice dropping even though they were alone. Your mother used to say there was a woman there when she was a girl too. Not the same woman. That would make her more than 80 years old. And this one they describe is young, beautiful. But your mother said it was a line, a woman who is never truly one woman, but always the same one, passed like a mask from one to the next. Passed how? Nobody knows for certain. Some say through blood. Some say the river chooses her. What your mother told me, and I want you to hear this clearly, Ada, because I am not telling you a folk tale. I am telling you what nearly happened to your own father before he married your mother, is that this woman offers something men cannot resist: ease, money that comes without the shame of poverty. And in exchange, she takes something back. Not all at once, slowly, like a debt collected in installments. Takes what? Nkechi was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that makes a room feel smaller. Your mother never said exactly. She said different men lost different things, but she said the men who spent the most nights with that woman always lost the thing that made them most themselves. For one man, it was his memory of his own children's names. For another, it was his ability to feel joy at all. He lived 20 more years after, they said, but never smiled again, not even once. Your mother's cousin, before he came to his senses and ran, he told her the woman spoke of it as payment, like she was a bank, and men's very selves were the currency. Adaeze did not stop at her aunt's story. The next morning, while Kelechi was out, presumably at Iyagba stream again, though he still called it the new client, she walked the dusty path to the far end of Igbeti, to the small, quiet compound where Papa Ikena's widow, Mama Neka, now an old woman herself, still lived alone with her memories and a house full of photographs of a husband who stopped speaking 15 years before he finally died. Mama Neka received her politely, offered her kola nut and water the way custom demanded, but her hands trembled slightly around the kola nut dish, as if the mere act of hosting a guest reminded her of the many silent meals she had shared with her own husband, feeding him with her own fingers, because his hands, though they still worked, seemed to have forgotten how to feed themselves once his voice went. You want to know about the woman by the stream, Mama Neka said, before Adaeze had even finished explaining why she'd come. It was not a question. Word travels fast in a town as small as Igbeti, and by then, half the compound wives had already begun whispering about Kelechi's mysterious new wealth. I want to know if there's a way back for a man who has already gone to her. Mama Neka's laugh was short and bitter, without much humor in it at all. My husband went to negotiate a land boundary, they always said. I never believed that. Ikena did not need to negotiate anything. The boundary had been settled since his father's time. He went there because he had heard, the way your husband must have heard, that the woman by the stream could make a struggling man comfortable again. He came back unable to say one word, not even my name, not even to tell me what had been done to him. And do you know the cruelest part, my dear? I spent 15 years not knowing, wondering every single day whether he even remembered loving me. Because a man who cannot speak cannot tell you, and a man who cannot tell you leaves you to imagine every possible answer, including the very worst ones. That not knowing was its own kind of theft. She did not just take his voice, she took my certainty for 15 years that I was still loved. Adaeze left that compound with her jaw set in a way her aunt had never seen before, a look that made Nkechi, waiting at the junction, take a small step backward before falling into step beside her. You mean to go to her, Nkechi said. Kelechi has not lost his voice yet. Anything this woman is planning has not happened yet. I am not going to spend 15 years like Mama Neka, feeling a silent man and wondering if he still loves me. If there's a debt to be paid, I want to understand its exact shape before it is paid in my husband's throat. She did not yet know she was already too late, that even as she walked home, resolved and sharpened by another woman's 15 years of grief at that very hour, Kelechi was already seated across from Ifeyinwa at that very hour, being handed a dark wooden cup and told, plainly and without trickery, exactly what it would cost him. Adaeze went home that night and looked at her sleeping husband for a long time, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering which part of him was already spent. Now, here is where the story would normally slow down, where a lesser telling would let you relax for a moment before dropping the next twist. I am not going to do that to you, because right now, at this very moment, in a locked room behind a door Kelechi was told not to open, something was waking up, and it had been waiting for him specifically, not for a man, for him. If you want to know why, don't go anywhere, because the next part changes everything you think you understood about this story. Ifeyinwa was not in fact one woman.
This is the part that will unsettle you, so let it. She was not 80 years old, wearing a young woman's skin through some simple magic. She was something the old stories never fully captured, because the old stories were told by frightened people trying to make sense of something too large for their language. She was a river spirit, yes, in the sense that people meant when they whispered Mami Wata or the woman of the stream. But she was also something more specific, more personal, more cruel in its precision. She was a debt collector for a bargain her own mother had made 3 generations ago, a bargain that had never been fully repaid, and that debt had been passed to her the way some families pass down land, except what she had inherited was not soil but hunger, a hunger that could only be fed one way, by taking pieces of men who came to her freely, who chose her with their own hearts, who never had to be forced or tricked, only tempted, because a gift taken willingly settles a debt far more completely than one that is stolen. The famine that had birthed this whole arrangement was not a story told often in Igbeti anymore, and the few elders who still remembered fragments of it from their own grandparents' telling usually described it only in the vaguest terms: a dry season that had refused to end for 3 consecutive years, wells sunk to mud, farms turned to dust, children buried faster than the ground could be properly consecrated for them. Ifeyinwa's grandmother, a young woman herself at the time, had gone to Yagba stream not out of any special wickedness, but out of the particular, unbearable helplessness of watching an entire community starve around her while she had no power to stop it. The spirit that answered her, old even then, older than the famine, older perhaps than the stream itself, had not demanded blood or death, only servitude, framed so gently at the time that the desperate young one had almost mistaken it for mercy. Rain came within the week, crops returned within the season, and the price, deferred generation after generation, the way a debt is deferred by a family too poor to pay it off in a single lump sum, quietly became somebody else's problem to carry, and then somebody else's again, until it arrived, finally, at a girl of 13 who had never once been asked whether she was willing to inherit her family's unpaid mercy. Every man before Kelechi paid a small piece, a memory, a talent, a capacity for joy. But the original debt, the one her grandmother's grandmother had struck with the river itself, back when Igbeti's founders were still clearing forest for farmland, it required a man's voice. Not his ability to make sound, but the thing his voice carried, his truth, his testimony, his power to name what was done to him and be believed. A voiceless man cannot accuse, cannot warn, cannot confess, cannot beg for help. He can only endure silently forever. And that silence, total, permanent, willing, was the only currency large enough to finally close a debt 3 generations old. She had chosen Kelechi carefully, not randomly,
Men who are already halfway to invisible in their own homes, men whose contracts have dried up, whose wives have started managing money without consulting them, whose children have stopped running to greet them at the door because there is nothing exciting left to greet. Those men give up their voice more easily than you'd think, because on some tired, wounded level, they already believe nobody is listening to it anyway. That night, the night that would take his voice forever, she did not trick him. This part matters, so don't let anyone tell you later that he never had a choice. She sat across from him with the wooden cup, dark as a night with no moon, and she told him the truth, or at least a truth-shaped piece of it. There is a price for everything I've given you. Tonight, if you drink from this cup, the price is paid and you never have to worry about money again. Your family will be provided for. But you will lose your voice. Not your ability to make a sound, my dear one. You will still be able to grunt, to cry, to hum a tune if you are feeling foolish. But you will never speak a true word again. Not your children's names, not a promise, not an apology, not a warning. That part of you, the part that tells the truth of what has happened to you, will be mine. Kelechi, hearing this laid out so plainly, should have run. Any reasonable man should have run, but exhaustion does strange things to reasonable men, and desperation does stranger things still. And he thought, in the fog of that moment, of his children's school fees, of the roof that needed repair before the next rain, of the particular grinding shame of watching his wife stretch soup over 3 days. He thought that a voice was a small thing to give up if it meant never watching his family go hungry again. He did not think even once of what it would cost Adaeze to be married to a silence instead of a husband. He drank. The cup was empty before he understood what emptying it meant. He woke the next morning in his own bed. She had returned him home, generous even in her cruelty. And when he opened his mouth to greet his wife, nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a croak. His throat worked, his tongue moved, his lips shaped the words, "Good morning, Ada," perfectly, and the room stayed silent as a grave. If this were a simple story, this is where it would end. A foolish man punished for his foolishness, a moral delivered neatly with a bow on top. But I told you at the start that nothing here is simple, and I meant it, because what happens next is going to make you question who the real victim of this story actually is, and I promise it is not who you think. Adaeze did not scream when her husband could not speak. She did something far more dangerous. She went completely, terrifyingly calm. A woman who has spent 9 years learning her husband's silences, his moods, the particular way he clears his throat before a lie, knows immediately when a new silence isn't ordinary. She sat him down at the kitchen table, took both his hands in hers, and said very quietly, "Blink once if someone did this to you." He blinked once, and tears he could not explain in words rolled down his face. Blink once if it was the woman by Yagba stream. He blinked, and this time he did not stop crying. Adaeze did not rage at him, not yet. That would come later, in private, in the particular fury reserved for a husband who has broken a marriage's deepest trust. Right then, she understood something more urgent. Her husband's silence was not a metaphor. It was a wound, still open, still bleeding invisibly. And if she did not act quickly, whatever had been taken might never be given back. She went to her aunt in Ikechi that same afternoon, dragging Kelechi along by the wrist like a woman dragging evidence to court. "You said my mother nearly fell into this. You said something stopped it. What was it?" Nkechi's face went the color of ash. "Your mother never told me the details, only that it involved going to the woman herself, not hiding, not running, facing her, and offering something the woman could not refuse. Because that is how these things work at Adaeze. They are not broken, they are only ever traded for something else." Then I will trade, Adaeze said, and there was something in her voice, flat, unwavering, the voice of a woman who has already decided the price she is willing to pay before she has even learnt what it is, made Nkechi grip her niece's hands and beg her to reconsider. She did not reconsider. Before we get to what happened at Iyagba stream, I need you to sit with this. Adaeze is about to walk toward the exact danger her husband walked toward willingly, except she is walking toward it for a completely different reason. And that difference, the reason a person enters the fire, is about to decide who walks out of it. Stay with me, because the middle of this story is where everything you assumed gets turned over like soil. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what's coming is the part everyone talks about after they've finished watching.
Adaeze went to the stream at dusk, the hour when the old people say the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirits grows thin as calm wine skin on a boiling pot. She did not go armed with charms or incense or any of the protective rituals her aunt begged her to at least attempt. She went with nothing but her wrapper, her bare feet, and a fury she had folded so tightly into calm that it had become something else entirely, something closer to courage. Ifeyinwa was waiting for her. Of course she was. A spirit who has collected death for 3 generations does not miss the sound of a wronged wife's footsteps approaching her compound. "You've come to beg," Ifeyinwa said, before Adaeze had even opened her mouth, her voice carrying that same warm, knowing quality that had disarmed Kelechi weeks before. "They always send the wives eventually. It never works. The debt is paid. There is nothing to beg for." "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer, because I think in 3 generations, nobody has ever actually asked you this. Do you want to be doing this?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, small, but the ripples went on longer than either woman expected. Ifeyinwa's composed, ageless face flickered, just for a moment, into something younger, something almost startled. "It is not about wanting," she said, but her voice had lost some of its music. "That's not what I asked." Here is the twist that changes everything, so listen closely. Ifeyinwa had never once, in 3 generations of collecting men's voices, wanted any of it. She had been a girl, an actual girl once, before the death claimed her the way it was now trying to claim men through her. Sacrificed by her own grandmother to settle a bargain the old woman had made out of desperation during a famine so severe that it had threatened to erase the entire village of Igbeti from memory. The river had offered survival for the village in exchange for one woman forever to serve as its collector. Ifeyinwa's grandmother, drowning in guilt and starvation both, had chosen not herself, but her own daughter, and that daughter had chosen hers, and so it went, an inheritance of servitude disguised generation after generation as inevitability. Every man who drank from that cup was not truly feeding Ifeyinwa's hunger. He was feeding a debt neither she nor any living person in Igbeti had actually chosen. A debt that outlived everyone who agreed to it, sustained now only because nobody had ever asked the collector herself whether she wished to keep collecting. "I was 13, Ifeyinwa said, and for the first time, her voice did not sound ageless at all. It sounded exactly as young and as frightened as the girl she had once been. My grandmother told the river spirit I would serve gladly. I never agreed to anything. I was simply told what I was, the way you might be told your own name." Adaeze felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. That will take longer than one conversation by a stream. But something adjacent to it, recognition. 2 women standing on opposite sides of the same theft, both robbed of a choice by people who claimed to love them.
Adaeze let the silence between them sit for a moment before she spoke again, because she understood, in the way only a woman who had spent 9 years learning to read her own husband's silences could understand, that Ifeyinwa's confession had cost her something too. An admission held inside so long that it had calcified, and breaking it open even slightly must have hurt. "How many?" Adaeze asked, quietly. "How many have you taken because you had no choice? And how many have you taken because somewhere along the line it stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like power?" It was a cruel question, and Adaeze knew it the moment it left her mouth. But she needed the true answer, not the comfortable one, because she had come too far to be satisfied with half of a truth. Ifeyinwa did not flinch from it. "Both," she said. "In the beginning, every man I called to that cup, I wept for afterwards, alone, in that room you heard humming behind my door. Because, yes, Adaeze, you should know, your husband heard them too, and still he drank. I wept for the first 10 men, perhaps the first 20, but grief, when it is not permitted to end, eventually teaches itself a new shape. Somewhere along the 40th man, I stopped weeping and started simply doing what was required of me, the way any woman learns to simply do what is required of her. And I will not stand here and pretend that some small poisoned part of me did not come to enjoy the ease of it, the way men looked at me, the way they trusted me, the way not one of them, not a single one in 3 generations, ever thought to ask whether I wanted any of this at all. You are the first. Then you understand, Adaeze, why I cannot simply walk away and let you decide alone whether my husband's voice was fairly taken. Then help me undo what was done to my husband. Not because you owe me, because you were never asked either, and I am asking you now, properly, as one woman to another. Is there a way to give him back his voice without another man losing his?" Here is where the story could have taken the easy road. A simple undoing, a spell reversed, everyone walks away whole. That is not what happened, and if you are still with me, you already suspected it wouldn't be, because I promised you this wasn't going to be predictable, and predictable stories don't deserve 11,000 words of your attention. Ifeyinwa explained the terrible arithmetic of the bargain. The debt could not simply be forgiven because it was not owed to her. It was owed to the river spirit that had saved Igbeti from famine 3 generations ago, and that spirit required its due regardless of who collected it or how she felt about collecting it. A voice once given could only be returned if something of equal weight was offered in its place. Not another man's voice. Ifeyinwa made clear she would not, could not take another victim in trade. Not after tonight. Not after finally being asked whether she wanted this life at all. What the river demanded instead was the truth itself, a full public confession of the original debt, spoken aloud by someone with authority and courage to speak it, breaking the silence that had let the arrangement continue unquestioned for 3 generations. Secrets, Ifeyinwa explained, were the actual currency the river fed on, not voices exactly, but the silences those stolen voices created, the unspoken shames that kept a village's fears buried instead of faced. A voice returned in exchange for a truth revealed. That was the only trade the river had ever honored. "Then I will speak it," Adaeze said, "whatever it costs me." "It will cost you your marriage's privacy," Ifeyinwa warned. "Everyone in Igbeti will know your husband's affair, know his shame, know mine. There is no version of this where you say the truth aloud and it stays quiet afterwards." Adaeze thought of her children, of the fees still unpaid, of 9 years of a marriage she had believed was whole until 3 weeks ago. And she thought, too, of this frightened girl trapped inside an ageless woman's body for longer than any human life should last, punished for a death struck before she was even born. "Some silences," Adaeze said, "have already cost too much. Let this one finally be spoken." If you thought the climax of this story was going to be a fight, or a curse, or a dramatic battle between wife and mistress, I need you to prepare yourself for something far more devastating, because the truth is always a sharper weapon than any spell. and what Adaeze did next would be remembered in Igbeti for generations, not as a scandal, but as the night the whole town's silence finally broke. Adaeze called for a village gathering the very next evening under the old Iroko tree at the center of Igbeti, the same tree where disputes were settled and marriages announced, and 3 generations ago where a desperate grandmother had once quietly struck a bargain with a river spirit while her neighbors starved around her, never telling a soul what she had traded to save them all. Adaeze stood beneath that same tree, her silent husband beside her, and she told the entire truth, not just of Kelechi's affair, though she spoke that too, without flinching, without hiding behind euphemisms. She told the truth of Ifeyinwa, of the girls sacrificed at 13, of the debt that had outlived every person who'd agreed to it, of every man in Igbeti's history who had lost some piece of himself to that stream and never understood why, because nobody had ever dared to say the words out loud before. The village gasped. Old men who remembered fathers who never smiled again, old women who remembered husbands who forgot their own children's names, an entire town's worth of silent grief given voice at last, standing beneath the same tree where the original bargain had been struck in secret. Mama Nneka, standing near the back of the crowd with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the warm evening, began to weep openly for the first time in 15 years. Not the quiet private weeping she had permitted herself in the dark of her own room, but a loud, shaking, public grief finally allowed to exist in the open air where her neighbors could witness it and share the weight of it with her. 2 other women Adaeze had never met came forward from the crowd as she spoke, each with her own version of the same story, a husband, a father, a brother who had gone to Iyaga stream comfortable and returned hollowed out, and who had lived out the remainder of his days wrapped in a silence the whole family had learned painfully never to ask about. One old man, easily in his 70s, stood at the very front, tears cutting clean paths through the dust on his weathered face, and when Adaeze finished speaking, he called out in a cracked voice that carried across the whole gathering, "My own brother. 50 years ago, I always thought it was shame that kept him quiet. I never once considered it might have been stolen from him." The village elder, an old woman named Iyaloja, who had presided over Igbeti's disputes for as long as anyone could remember, rose slowly from her stool beneath the tree and asked the question that silenced even the murmuring crowd completely. If this debt was struck to save this very village from the famine that would have killed us all 3 generations ago, then in some fashion, every person standing beneath this tree tonight owes their life to that bargain, whether we asked for it or not. What then do we owe her in return for carrying alone what all of us in truth benefited from? It was not a question anyone had an easy answer for, and Adaeze did not pretend to have one. She said, "I cannot answer what the whole village owes her. I can only tell you what I owe her, which is the truth, spoken plainly, so that no other wife in Igbeti spent 15 years wondering the way Mama Nneka did, whether her husband still loved her, when the real answer was never about love at all, but a debt none of us were ever told we were paying." And as Adaeze finished speaking, as the last truth left her mouth into open air, witnessed by an entire village instead of buried in shame, Kelechi felt something break loose in his throat, like a stone finally dislodged from a blocked stream. He opened his mouth, and for the first time in 3 weeks, sound came out. Not a grand speech, not an eloquent apology, just one broken, tear-soaked word, the first word given back to him. Ada. Just her name, but her name, spoken freely after everything, was worth more to her than any apology could have been. Their 2 children were standing at the edge of the crowd the whole time, kept back by Nkechi's careful hand on their shoulders, too young to fully understand deaths and river spirits and generations-old bargains, but old enough to understand that their father, who had been strangely, frighteningly silent at the dinner table for 3 whole weeks, had just said their mother's name out loud in front of the entire town. Their 9-year-old son broke free from Nkechi's grip first, running to his father and asking, in the blunt, uncomplicated way only a child can manage in a moment thick with adult grief, "Papa, can you say my name too?" And Kelechi, kneeling in the dust beneath the Iroko tree, with his son's face in his rough hands, found that this word too came easier than he expected, though his voice cracked so badly on the boy's name that half the gathered crowd found themselves wiping their own eyes, remembering silent men of their own, husbands and fathers and brothers who had never gotten a night like this one. Adaeze watched her husband say their children's names one after the other, each syllable a small, ordinary miracle that nobody in that crowd would ever again take for granted. And she understood, standing there, beneath the same tree where a desperate grandmother had once traded away a girl's whole life without asking her, that whatever came next for her and Kelechi, however long the road back to real trust might be, she had at least given her children back a father who could speak to them honestly, which was more than Mama Nneka, more than 100 women before her, stretching back 3 generations, had ever been given the chance to do. Before I tell you what happened next, because this is not in fact a happy ending, and I promised you the truth of that too, subscribe now if this story has held you the way I think it has, because what happens to Kelechi and Adaeze after that night is the part people message me about the most, and it will not be what you expect. Ifeyinwa, released from a debt that had never truly been hers to carry, did not vanish in some tidy puff of magic. That's not how 3 generations of servitude ends. She remained in Igbeti, though the compound with the iron gate slowly emptied of its strange wealth, the aluminium roof eventually replaced by ordinary tin like everyone else's. She grew old finally for the first time in longer than anyone could count, grey hair coming in slow and human and mortar. And she spent what years she had left telling the story herself to any young woman in Igbeti who would listen, warning them of the bargains their elders might have struck without ever asking whether the ones who paid the price had agreed to pay it. And Kelechi and Adaeze, their marriage did not simply return to what it had been before, whole and unblemished, as if 3 weeks of betrayal could be erased by one confession beneath an Iroko tree. Trust, once broken, does not repair itself in a single scene, no matter how satisfying that scene might feel. Kelechi spent the following year earning back, in small and unglamorous ways, the thing he had nearly traded away completely. Not just his voice, but his right to be believed when he used it. He took every job he could find, however humble. He told Adaeze the truth, even when it cost him, about small failures, small temptations, small fears, because he had learned in the worst possible way exactly what silence costs a marriage and exactly what a voice is worth once you understand it can be taken from you.
In the weeks that followed, Igbeti was a town relearning how to speak about things it had spent generations learning to bury. Families who had never once discussed the strange, silent men in their lineage now sat together in the evenings, piecing together stories that suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. An uncle's permanent quiet, a grandfather's refusal to ever discuss his youth, a cousin twice removed who died without ever telling his own children that he loved them, not because he didn't, but because the words had been taken from him before they were born. The church pastor devoted an entire Sunday sermon to the dangers of silent deaths, though he was careful, in the way pastors in small towns often are, not to name Ifeyinwa directly, referring to her only as the one by the water, a title that Adaeze noticed with a small, grim satisfaction,
no longer carried any real fear when spoken aloud in daylight among neighbors, instead of in frightened whispers behind closed doors. Kelechi's own recovery was neither instant nor complete. Though his voice had returned to him that night beneath the iroko tree, he found in the weeks after that certain words still came to him more slowly than others. An apology, in particular, seemed to catch somewhere in his throat every time he tried to offer Adaeze a full one, as though some residue of what had been taken lingered even after the theft itself had been undone. He would start the sentence, get halfway through, "I'm sorry, Ada, I never meant," and find the rest of it simply would not come, no matter how badly he wanted it. It was Adaeze, in the end, who told him gently, one evening on their veranda, that she did not need the perfect apology, the eloquent one, the one that tied every loose thread of his betrayal into a neat and satisfying bow. "I don't need your words to be beautiful, Kelechi," she said. "For 3 weeks, I would have given anything just to hear you make a sound at all. Don't waste what you've been given trying to make it sound impressive. Just tell me true things, small and clumsy if they have to be, and let that be enough." So he did. He told her clumsily, without eloquence, about the shame that had driven him to Ifeyinwa's compound in the first place. Not the affair itself, which he had already confessed beneath the iroko tree for the whole town to hear, but the private shame underneath it, the feeling of being invisible at his own dinner table, the particular ache of watching his own children stop running to greet him because there was nothing exciting left in a father who had nothing to offer. Adaeze, in turn, admitted things she had never said aloud either. How frightened she had been in those 2 lean years before the affair of becoming a wife who managed a household instead of loving a husband. How the constant arithmetic of survival had worn away at her patience in ways she was ashamed of, and how some small, guilty part of her had almost understood, even amid her fury, why a man starved of purpose might reach for anything that made him feel wanted again. None of this excused what had happened. Both of them were careful in the months that followed never to let understanding slide into excusing, because a marriage rebuilt on excuses is a marriage rebuilt on the same silence that nearly destroyed them. But understanding, spoken honestly between 2 people who both nearly lost everything to a debt neither of them had chosen, became the uneven, imperfect foundation on which something new and sturdier was slowly laid, brick by brick, the way Kelechi had always known best how to build. Adaeze never fully forgot what he had done, and she never pretended to. She forgave him not because he deserved instant forgiveness, but because she had watched him earn, slowly, the right to be trusted with his own voice again, one honest word at a time. Theirs became, in the years after, not a perfect marriage, but an honest one, which in Igbeti, where so many marriages carried silent debts nobody spoke of, was its own kind of rare and hard-won treasure. Ifeyinwa's final years were quieter than anyone in Igbeti, watching an ageless woman finally grow old before their eyes, could have imagined. She moved from the large compound with the iron gate into a smaller house near the market, closer to the ordinary bustle of the town she had watched from a careful distance for 3 generations without ever truly belonging to it. She took in 2 apprentices, both young women whose own families had, generations back, benefited quietly from the very bargain that had cost her her freedom, and she taught them herbal medicine instead of debts, midwifery instead of servitude, insisting whenever the old stories came up that the girls learn every version of what had happened to her, not so they could pity her, but so they would recognize faster than she ever did the particular danger of an elder who says it is simply how things are done, instead of explaining why. She never married. She told Adaeze once, in one of the strange, careful friendships that sometimes grow between women who had stood on opposite sides of the same wound, that she did not think she had it left in her to trust a man with anything as fragile as her own voice, not after 3 generations spent collecting the voices of other women's husbands. But she attended every one of Igbeti's festivals in her final years, sat beneath the same Iroko tree where her secret had been finally spoken aloud, and told any child who would listen the true story of the famine, the bargain, and the girl who had never been asked, not as a ghost story meant to frighten, but as a plain, unembellished history, the way she believed every hard truth in Igbeti deserved to be told from then on. Kelechi, for his part, never took another job near Iyagba stream, though the land itself, once Ifeyinwa's strange wealth dried up and the debt was finally truly closed, became ordinary farmland again within a few short years, worked by ordinary families who grew ordinary yams and cassava, with no memory at all of what the soil beneath their feet had once carried. He rebuilt his reputation slowly, the way he rebuilt everything, one honest wall at a time. And within 3 years, the contracts that had once dried up so mysteriously began returning to him just as steadily, though this time he never wondered whether some unseen hand was behind his fortune, good or bad. He had learned in the hardest possible way to be suspicious of any comfort that arrived without an honest explanation attached to it. On quiet evenings, long after the children were grown and the whole affair had settled into the kind of story Igbeti told at weddings and funerals alike, a cautionary tale wrapped around a genuine, hard-won redemption, Adaeze would sometimes catch her husband staring out toward the direction of the stream, not with longing, she was certain of that much, but with something closer to a permanent quiet vigilance. The look of a man who understood, in a way most people never have to learn firsthand, exactly how much a voice is worth, and how easily, in a single moment of tiredness and shame, it can be traded away for something that only feels like relief. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a town after a secret that old finally comes into the light. And Igbeti wore that quiet for a long time afterward. Not the frightened, watchful silence of a place still hiding something, but the tired, settled quiet of a place that has finally put something heavy down after carrying it for far longer than anyone alive could remember picking it up. Mothers began telling their daughters, plainly, without the old euphemisms, exactly what had happened by Iyagba stream, not to frighten them away from the water, but to teach them the actual lesson buried inside 3 generations of half-told folklore, that a bargain struck in desperation by one generation has a way of quietly becoming another generation's unquestioned inheritance, and that the only real defense against that kind of theft is the same thing that finally broke it: the plain, unglamorous courage to ask an honest question out loud, and to keep asking it even when the silence around you insists that some things are simply not meant to be spoken. Kelechi and Adaeze's children grew up knowing their family's history in full, in a way most families in Igbeti, even now, still struggled to talk about openly. Their son, the same boy who had once asked his silenced father whether he could say his name, grew into a young man who talked more than most, almost as if some part of him had absorbed, without ever being told directly, exactly how precious an ordinary sentence could be. Their daughter grew into a woman known throughout Igbeti for asking the questions nobody else in the room was willing to ask, the sort of blunt, necessary honesty that made some people uncomfortable and made the people who truly knew her trust her completely. Neither of them ever met Ifeyinwa as anything other than the gentle, quiet old herbalist near the market, and neither of them ever fully understood until they were much older exactly how much their own existence, their father's return, their parents' hard-won honesty, the ordinary, unremarkable comfort of a dinner table where everyone spoke freely had cost the strange old woman who taught them, without ever saying so directly, that some silences are worth breaking, no matter what they cost you to break them. That is the story of the man who spent one night with his side chick and lost his voice forever, and the wife who understood that the only way to break a debt built on silence was to speak the truth louder than the shame that had buried it for 3 generations. If this story moved you, if it made you think of every silence in your own life you've been too afraid to break, then let it be the reason you subscribe tonight, because there's another story waiting, and I promise you, the debt in that one has not been paid yet either.